я переехал в Турцию и пытаюсь что-то делать полезное. Но в Лондоне я был просто много fellowship, это 10 месяцев было. Закончил 2 года. Потом в Нью-Йорке год провел, и понял, что уже пока не держит. Ну, я чувствуюсь влюбленным в себя. Реформа энергетики в Болгарии и Греции, как это на этом моей России. Еще что-то делать, приезжать. Настя Керлин. 27 апреля. Хочешь, я тебе пришлю? Ну, я бы что мы, кстати, с Тором поговорили. Да. Нет, я был с ним занят, но он мне сказал, что звонить ему. Это было, правда, до моего приезда, я с тех пор никак не напишу то, что обещал. Я знаю, что он сам там был сильно занят. Да, он всегда... Да, это... Мне кажется, это даже люди вообще разрешили общаться. Ну, конечно, категорически ощущение способности. Это не повод к тому, чтобы да. Нет, не общался. А, нет, я читал.
Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. My name is John Herbst. I am the director of the Dinu Patriciu Eurasia Center. And I see we've got a wonderful crowd because we've got a wonderful event. We're going to talk about what's going on with the investigation of the murder of Boris Nemtsov. And we've got Carl Gershom here from NED. We've got Vladimir Karamurza, who everyone knows, the courageous journalist who continues to work in Russia despite some problems he encountered there. And we have Zhana Nemtsova, Boris's daughter, who's been a truly inspiration to us all as we look at the murder and the implications. And with that, I'm going to get out of the way and bring Carl up here. Thank you. Okay. Yeah.
Well, I'm happy to welcome everyone today to this very important meeting. And I just want to begin by, first of all, thanking the Atlantic Council for doing this. John, Damon, Alina, we're really very, very grateful to you, and I think you know that. And I want to just say how honored I am to be in a position where I can introduce and speak with people like Zhana and Vladimir, whose courage really overwhelms me. And I said that at a meeting we had in the Senate that the Atlantic Council sponsored just last month on the anniversary of the murder of Boris Nemtsov, and the courage of the Russian activists who continue to work under such extraordinary threats is something that should humble all of us. I think, as is well known, Boris Nemtsov was the first governor of the Nizhny Novgorod Oblast and the vice premier of Russia, Security Council member in the late 90s, the leader of the parliamentary group of the Union of Right Forces, later the co-chair of the Republican Party of Russia, the People's Freedom Party, Parnas. And given his prominence as a Russian political leader, it's of course deeply disturbing that the investigative committee of the Russian Federation, chaired by Alexander Bystrykin, has consistently rejected requests by the lawyers representing the family of Boris Nemtsov to qualify his murder under Article 277 of the Russian Criminal Code as an attempt on the life of a public statesman. And as we also know from the announcement of this meeting, Bystrykin announced in January that the investigation into the murder of Nemtsov had been solved. And we'll hear more about that today. And first, we're going to hear from Boris Nemtsov's daughter, Zhana, who is a journalist and a social activist. She managed her father's website. She worked for Radio Echo Moskvy. And after,
No.
Oh, Echo of Moscow? Echo of Moscow? Echo of Moscow?
No, I now work.
Yeah, well, I know. I'm going to say that. But I mean, before.
All right.
Yeah, and after Boris Nemtsov was assassinated, Zhana, in addition to advocating a proper investigation, received threats and had to emigrate to Germany, where she now works with Deutsche Welle.
That's right.
Okay.
But I used to work for RBC Television. I used to
Okay.
work for Echo Moskva many years ago when I was really young. I was 15 or 14 years old.
Okay, all right. Well,
My father wanted me to start
That's the
my
problem.
career very early.
that's the problem when you Google. All right. But in any event, in August, Zhana received the Solidarity Prize in Poland, which is a very, very important prize that was created by the legacy of the Solidarity movement in Poland. And just earlier this week, she was given the International Women of Courage Award by Secretary John Kerry. And so we're going to hear first from Jana, but then also right after her from Vladimir. John, alluded to certain troubles that he's had, but let me speak a little bit more specifically about that. Vladimir was a close friend of Boris Nemtsov and his deputy leader of the People's Freedom Party. For 9 years in Washington, he was the Washington bureau chief for the RTVI independent television network. And last April 30th, he spoke at a symposium we organized in the US Congress. David was also a member of that symposium, Leon Wieseltier and others, memorializing Boris Nemtsov. And just 3.5 weeks after that symposium in the US Congress on May 26th, he suffered a severe poisoning that resulted in multiple organ failures and a coma, and that nearly led to his death. And miraculously, he survived. The doctors had given him only a 5% chance to live, and he has now returned to Russia. He recovered and has now returned to Russia to continue his work for democracy and human rights. And I think, as many here know, the threats against Vladimir continue. And in February, Kadyrov posted a video on his Instagram page with Vladimir and fellow oppositionists, the former Prime Minister Mikhail Kasyanov, shown through the crosshairs of a sniper rifle. And the video was accompanied by a Kadyrov threat: whoever doesn't get it will get it. Jana and Vladimir and others are called by Kadyrov traitors and enemies of the people. And I think the fact that they continue their work as they do and that they're speaking here with us today is just an extraordinary tribute, not just to their courage, but to the courage of the people in Russia who continue to carry out this fight, despite the fact that we had a meeting here last week. Many people here might have been here with Ilya Yashin and the release of his report, A Threat to National Security. There's an editorial about it in the Washington Post today. Kadyrov is a killer, allied with Putin. Putin has just supported him and appointed him to be the acting leader of Chechnya. There'll be elections in September that he'll win, of course. Mm-hmm. And he remains someone who has threatened the kind of people we'll be talking with today. So Jana will begin, then Vladimir will have some words about the public reaction to this, and then we're going to hear from David and John, who'll have some comments, maybe some questions. We'll have a discussion, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So let's begin with Jana.
Thank you very much. I would like to add to what you have already said. I work for Deutsche Welle. I'm a journalist. I continue my journalistic career, but also I have recently established Boris Nemtsov Foundation for Freedom, also in Germany. My important goal of my life is, of course, investigation process, and it's very difficult right now. And from the first day, I was sure that we won't have any proper and objective and thorough investigation in Russia. And unfortunately, my prediction was true. So I would say about the current status of the investigation process. First of all, I have a legal status there as a victim. So I can file applications, requests, and things like that. Currently, what's going on now is that 5 suspects are held in custody. These 5 people, I think most probably were those people who committed the crime, so triggermen. And there will be a trial. The trial will start, I think, in summer or in spring. But the problem with the investigation is that it is blocked. A few days after my father was assassinated, Putin said he would take this investigation under his personal control to ensure that's true. To ensure that the investigation is carried out thoroughly and objectively. So, and now we see what's the result of his personal control, and I'm absolutely sure that he controls the investigation process and actually blocks it. Even the investigative team admits that they were organizers and those people who masterminded this crime. And they carry on with the investigation, but it's a pure formality because they don't take any steps trying to find organizers, though there are evidence who might be involved, and they also do not take any steps trying to find those people who might order this crime. All my applications to requalify this assassination were neglected, were refused. All my applications asking for questioning Kadyrov and his inner circle were refused. And even the investigative team wanted at least to find one of the organizers. His name is Ruslan Gurimeyev. He's very close to Kadyrov. And they wanted to put him on the wanted list and to question him and to convict him. But when they filed an official application to Mr. Bastrykin, who is the head of the Central Investigative Committee, Bastrykin didn't sign it. That means that high-ranking officials provide cover-up, not only for Kadyrov, but for all those people who are around him and who are close to him. That is why the investigation is blocked, and there are few mechanisms how you can influence the investigation process. I'm not very powerful to confront it, but I think that it is important to put constant pressure on this and to resist what's going on with the investigation process. What we have recently done with my lawyers representing my interests in the investigation process is that we filed an application to the European Court of Human Rights, and this application was registered. Secondly, we had a special event in the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe held on the 25th of January. These were hearings on the investigation of into the murder of my father. And we want the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe to appoint a special reporter, which is not an investigation, but rather a mechanism of control over the investigation. And under the motion of resolution, we got over 60 signatures in one day. And I hope that in April there will be another session, and I hope very much that this reporter will be appointed to have an official position of the European Union in regard to this investigation. And also I want to point out that though I'm very weak compared to Putin and his system, nonetheless, I was once asked not to insist on questioning Kadyrov, not to call for international control over the investigation, to change my lawyer, and things like that. And I realized that though I was very weak, I should do what I'm doing right now, and I would like to thank Vladimir Koromorza and other people who support me in this process. I think that it is important to go on with the investigation, not only because it's very personal for me and I think it's important to fight for justice, but it's also important to stop further violence against opposition leaders. If our government understands that there is resistance, it's more reluctant to act violently against people who, not only the leaders of opposition, but those people who think independently. Thank you.
Thank you, Zhan. And we have to think about everything we can do here with Europe, with our friends. We'll talk about that, to continue to raise this issue so that these things can't happen in the dark of night when nobody's paying attention. In any event, Vladimir is going to talk more about this. Go ahead, Vladimir.
Thank you very much, Carla. And I'd like to first of all thank the Atlantic Council for hosting us here, and National Endowment for Democracy, the McCain Institute, and the Institute of Modern Russia for co-sponsoring this event. It's good to see you all. 5 weeks ago, on the first anniversary of Boris's murder, we held a March of Remembrance in Moscow. We walked down exactly the same route that he took for his very last march in his life. It was a march against the war with Ukraine in September 2014. We walked down the Boulevard Ring from Pushkinskaya Square to Sakharov Avenue. For those of you who know Moscow, it's a pretty long route. And there was one point at which Boris himself always liked to stop briefly. It was a point when you pass Trubner Square and go back up on the Boulevard Ring, and he would always ask everybody to stop for a minute and look back, because it was a good vantage point at which you can see whether there are many people or not, whether the turnout is good or not. And so on the 27th of February, we stopped at the same place where he always liked to stop and look back, and there was just a sea of faces, just a sea of people as far as the eye could see. And there were tens of thousands of people who came in, despite the atmosphere, despite the situation, despite the threats that we have in Russia today. And of course, we had the same march a year ago for him. And on the day of his funeral, on the 3rd of March last year, the line of Muscovites who came to say goodbye stretched from the Yauza River along the Garden Ring to Kursky Railroad Station for more than a mile. And every day, for more than a year now, people continue to bring flowers and candles and pictures to the spot where he was murdered, on Bolshoi Moskoretsky Bridge, which is now known unofficially by many people in Moscow as the Nemtsov Bridge. So Russia has not forgotten. But of course, those people who today call themselves the government of Russia behave in a very different way. And from the very beginning, officials of the current regime have done everything they can to try to eradicate the public memory of Boris Nemtsov, whom they have actually called little more than an average citizen. These are the words of Dmitry Peskov, the official spokesman for President Vladimir Putin. The Moscow City Duma and the Moscow City government, which are controlled by Putin's United Russia Party, obviously, have rejected a petition signed by thousands of Muscovites to establish an official memorial, a plaque in Moscow for Boris Nemtsov. They cited a lack of consensus. So apparently there was consensus for naming Moscow streets after Venezuelan dictator Hugo Chavez, or former Chechen strongman Ahmad Kadyrov, who'd once declared a jihad against Russia. There was consensus with those, no problem. But not for the leader of the Russian Democratic Opposition, former Deputy Prime Minister, former Member of Parliament. The unofficial memorial on the Moskoretsky Bridge is being regularly ravaged by the Moscow municipal services with the help of the police. It has happened 6 or 7 times already since the beginning of this year. And so given this attitude from the authorities, I don't think it's surprising that we see so many problems with the official investigation process that Jana has just detailed. As she said, they have pointedly and consistently refused to qualify his assassination under Article 277 of the Criminal Code of the Russian Federation, which is an attempt on the life of a public statesman. They have not even once, not even formally questioned Ramzan Kadyrov, despite the obvious links of the alleged perpetrators who are under arrest with him. As Jana mentioned, Alexander Bastrykin has personally twice vetoed attempts by investigators to include Ruslan Gerimeyev, who is the deputy commander of the Sever Battalion at the Interior Ministry of the Russian Federation, who is under the direct command of Kadyrov, as one of the organizers of the assassination. And Karl, as you mentioned, Mr. Bastrykin, in an interview with Rossiyskaya Gazeta a few weeks ago, publicly announced that the murder of Boris Nemtsov has been solved. And just to be clear, according to the official version, which is going to go into trial in a few weeks' time, the assassination of the leader of the Russian opposition, 200 meters away from the Kremlin wall, in what is probably the most secure area, not just in Moscow, but in the whole of Europe, was masterminded by a driver. That is the official version that is going to trial. Ruslan Mukhudinov, a Chechen driver, is the only person named on that list. So I think we can say with confidence that the official investigation process in Russia is not being conducted in good faith, and is not being conducted free from political constraints. Unfortunately, there is nothing that can substitute a national investigation process. The UN mechanism requires consent by the national government, as was the case with the Rafik Hariri investigation and the Benazir Bhutto investigation. In both cases, the governments of respectively Lebanon and Pakistan gave their consent. Of course, we're not going to get that consent from Vladimir Putin. So the second best thing we have to do, and we can do, is if we cannot achieve an international investigation for now, we can at least achieve international oversight and international attention so that they are not allowed to sweep this under the carpet and just forget about it and move on. And so a few weeks ago, we urged the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe to appoint a special rapporteur, as Jana mentioned. We are urging the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly to do the same. And we would like to also urge the United States government, in its bilateral contacts with Russian officials, to raise this issue consistently, publicly and privately, in their interactions with officials of the current regime. John Kerry seems to be meeting with Mr. Lavrov every other week. And it would be good if he passed that message, and others pass that message, to show that you've not forgotten and to show that you care. And just 2 or 3 weeks ago, actually, the US Senate Foreign Relations Committee marked up Senate Resolution 378 unanimously, which has as one of its points a recommendation that at every bilateral contact with the government of Russia, US government officials raise the issue and emphasize the importance of bringing the conspirators of this crime to justice. All the conspirators, of course, including the organizers, including the masterminds. And I think it would be really important if the full Senate also passed this resolution and the US administration heeded this recommendation. And I want to take this opportunity just to thank Senator Johnson, Senator Cardin, Senator McCain, Senator Wicker, Senator Rubio, and other members who have co-signed this resolution of the Foreign Relations Committee. As Boris always emphasized, issues of human rights and justice are not internal affairs. They're subject to international obligations and international oversight, including by institutions of which the Russian Federation is a full member, like the Council of Europe, like the OSCE. So we hope that they exercise this oversight and don't let the Kremlin forget. I think it's also very important to take measures against those whom we know shared the responsibility for what happened on the 27th of February last year. Those who have created this atmosphere of hatred, of intimidation, of violence that made it possible to assassinate the leader of the Russian democratic opposition in front of the Kremlin wall. I mean, of course, the Streichers and the Nahimanas of today's Russia, the state propagandists, employees of the state television, of the state propaganda machine, who have day in and day out used government-controlled airwaves to denounce Boris Nemtsov as a traitor, as a foreign agent, as an enemy of Russia, as part of the fifth column. At the very least, these individuals should be included in the visa blacklists of all Western democratic countries and should not be allowed to travel freely in those countries that they vilify in their own programs on a daily basis, but that they so much enjoy traveling to and keeping their assets in. And on this note, actually, there was a very good piece of news coming just yesterday from the European Parliament, where Jean and I were just 3 weeks ago, and I discussed this same issue with several European legislators, and just yesterday the European People's Party, which is the largest political group in the European Parliament, has publicly backed our initiative to include the 8 employees of the state television, state propaganda machine, who were personally involved in the incitement against Boris Nemtsov in the EU visa blacklist. And we're hoping that the European Parliament will take up this issue and vote on it soon. And I certainly hope that the US government and the US Congress follow suit. And just on a last note, Boris Nemtsov always said that it is only our job to bring democratic change to Russia and to make sure that we have a system of government that is based on the rule of law, on political freedoms, on respect for international norms. And it is absolutely true, and that day will come. And I think that would be the best possible tribute to Boris Nemtsov and his memory. And I also know that the day will come when all of those involved in this crime, including the higher-ups, will be brought to justice. But I think it's very important that here and today, our friends and our colleagues in the free world, in the democratic world, show their solidarity, show that they care, and make sure that there is oversight of this investigation process, and that this crime is not allowed to be swept under the carpet, and that Boris Nemtsov is not forgotten. And I hope that they take steps to do this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vladimir, for those very, very forceful and eloquent remarks. I want to pose a question, maybe John, to you and to David. In the Washington Post editorial this morning, based on an interview with Ilya Yashin, it raises a very fundamental question, which is, if indeed Putin, who has just met with Kadyrov and appointed him acting governor with his compliments of Chechnya, is complicit in acts that should disqualify him, in acts of what we're talking about here. If there is complicity by the government of Russia in these acts, the Washington Post asked, should this disqualify him from being a strategic partner of the United States? Now, that's a tough question. I mean, I know it is. In Washington today, we're having this big meeting of all the countries about the nuclear summit. And there was a big ad in the paper yesterday, maybe some of you have seen it, signed by 100 eminent people about how we have to control nuclear weapons and prevent them from getting into the hands of terrorists, which is obviously a very serious problem. And they say in this statement, it was really a statement directed at two governments, the United States and Russia, because these two governments have most of the nuclear material. They need to work together. Despite all the problems, they need to work together. So in this kind of a context, and there are other issues as well, I mean, how do you respond to what the Washington Post said this morning about if indeed he is complicit, and our friends from Russia here can speak to that issue and have spoken to that issue, that indeed there is complicity. How does that affect Russia's being in the position of a strategic partner?
I think that raises a difficult question which requires a nuanced answer. And nuance here is not a dodge to avoid the issue. We chose at a time in history to a strategic partner who was a monster of historic proportions. And I'm thinking of Joseph Stalin, because we had a problem with another monster of historic proportions. And I don't think there was any problem with us having that strategic alliance at that time for that purpose. The way this question was phrased is a little bit besides the point. Because whether or not the government of Mr. Putin is complicit in the murder of Mr. Nemtsov, it's pretty clear they were complicit, and more than complicit, in the murder of Mr. Litvinenko. And we saw a report come out in Britain, which was surprising for its candor in making that clear. But then we also read the news stories that senior officials in London said, well, you know, Russia's too important, we shouldn't do anything, in response to this. And I think that, and I'll comment on that as a way of commenting on your question, I think that was a mistake. There are issues with which Britain, or for that matter the United States, can and should cooperate with Russia. But there are also other interests which we have relating to human decency, relating to human rights, which should put a limit on our relationship with Mr. Putin's government. And we are able to pursue interests, whether it's in nuclear non-proliferation, although, of course, by invading Ukraine after Ukraine gave up nuclear weapons, Russia committed the single greatest crime against non-proliferation that I can think of. But there are issues where we'll have to cooperate with Russia, and we should, but recognize that as a result of their unacceptable behavior elsewhere, we're going to place sanctions on them, and we're going to place limits on our relationship. So it's not a quick soundbite, but that's, I think, the way we should approach this.
Dave?
I don't do nuance very well, so I'll answer. That's why John is the true diplomat. And actually, someone once said to me, even when I was a diplomat, I wasn't very diplomatic. So I took that as a compliment. We don't have a strategic partnership, and we won't have a strategic partnership with Russia as long as Putin and his circle are in the Kremlin. This is a regime that murders its own people. Putin came to power, let's remember, after very suspicious bombings that killed 300 Russians back in 1999, then the resumption of war with Chechnya, which tens of thousands of people were killed and injured and dislocated. He took over statewide TV. He went after the biggest oligarch he could find. Journalists and activists are poisoned, are killed, are harassed, intimidated, jailed. And then you look at how the regime treats its own people. We shouldn't be surprised that it invades Georgia in 2008, launches a cyber attack against Estonia in 2007, invades Ukraine in 2014 to the present day, or goes into Syria to prop up Assad, a like-minded leader who has tremendous blood on his hands, as does Mr. Putin. So this talk about, well, we shouldn't go too far. What's the tipping point for people who keep holding out this prospect of strategic partnership? How many more people cross the threshold for us to say, you know what, this isn't going to work? It isn't going to work as long as Putin is sitting there and the people like Putin is sitting there. And we shouldn't hold out this false hope that we can get back together again with Russia and sing Kumbaya around the campfire. How was that for nuance?
You're right. We don't do nuance.
Well, of course, there's always a larger context, and we could go on forever about that, because there are things that you can do, even if you're working with them. I mean, obviously, there are things we could be doing in Ukraine that we're not doing, and we talked about that the other day.
And by the way, John and others deserve a lot of credit last year for producing a report on Ukraine, urging that we provide military assistance to help Ukraine defend itself. So my kudos to you and the others who were involved in that.
There are ways to raise the price, and then there are some other ideas, Vladimir, that you've proposed, even about how to name the street around the Russian embassy. You want to tell us what?
On the way here, we passed, of course, 16th Street, the Andrei Sakharov Plaza,
right?
Which was named in 1984 by a congressional decision when Andrei Sakharov was in an exile in Gorky, and that was done with President Reagan's active support, I believe, as a gesture of solidarity, so that every day on all their correspondence, the Soviet embassy would have to write, Embassy of the USSR, number 1, Andrei Sakharov Plaza. And for the same reason, there was the Sakharov-Bonner corner named in New York City, I believe, where the consulate is, and the Sharansky Plaza, where the Soviet mission of the United Nations was. And I do believe that it would be a very good idea to name that piece of Wisconsin Avenue just in front of the Embassy of the Russian Federation, Boris Nemtsov Plaza, and make that the official address of the Russian Embassy. And I know that there will come a day when the Russian Embassy will wear this address with pride.
Yeah. I agree.
But we'll have to make them wear it now. Yep. So I think if there were a proposal to this effect, it'd be a very important one. And also, actually, it wouldn't be just a symbolic thing either, because Boris Nemtsov actually has a relationship with this particular embassy building in Washington. He was there at the opening of it. It was September 1994. And I don't know if we have any people from the Clinton administration here, but they would remember it, because I spoke to Strobe Talbot about it recently, and he recalled how this was President Yeltsin's state visit here to Washington. And during one of the evenings of the state visit, he gave a dinner in his name at the new Russian embassy for President Clinton and his administration. And the Russian embassy was just being opened at that time, because there was, of course, you remember this whole saga about the surveillance at the US embassy in Moscow and at the Russian embassy here. So for many years they stood empty. Finally, in 1994, the issues were resolved. Both embassies were open. And Boris was actually there. He was a member of President Yeltsin's delegation as governor of Nizhny Novgorod. And it was at that meeting that President Yeltsin presented him to President Clinton as the next president of Russia. And that's detailed in Boris's own book, The Provincial in Moscow. Strobe Talbot confirmed it when I spoke to him recently. So he actually has a history with that specific building as well. So I think from both of those points of view, it would be a very appropriate thing to do. And I hope there will be action taken up on this in the Congress, which I believe has jurisdiction over DC, right, and over the street names.
Well, there are a number of organizations represented here that have relationships in this town. I mean, that sounds like a very good idea to work on.
Carl, can I pick up on one thing Vladimir said earlier about adding the hate mongers to the sanctions list, and I remember you and Mikhail Kasyanov came here actually about a year ago.
A year ago, yeah. And we spoke actually here about this.
Exactly, advocating for the inclusion of these 8 individuals, people like Dmitry Kiselyov, who, by the way, is on the EU sanctions list, but for Ukraine, not for any human rights violations. But in addition to adding those names, which I 100% support, we also need to look at Western advertisers who provide funding for Russian TV, for Kremlin-controlled TV. I talked to Peter Pomerantsev about this last week, and he was reminding me that after the TV goes through its anti-American, anti-Western diatribes, you then break to a commercial featuring, I won't identify or single out a particular product, but a Western product or a Western company. And I don't think there's anything legislatively that can be done about that, but Western firms should be ashamed to provide financial support for these kinds of channels that are spewing hate that lead to the murders of our friends. So again, if you're on boards or you're a shareholder, raise this with companies. They shouldn't be advertising on Russian Kremlin-controlled TV. That would be a way to take money away from them.
I want to, before I open it up to the audience, I just want to raise one very interesting point that was implied, Vladimir, when you said that one day, if indeed the street where the Russian embassy is was called Boris Nemtsov Plaza, that Russia would be proud of that, which obviously suggests that Russia could have a different future and different leadership. And I just want to talk about that for a moment with everyone. We've heard that Putin is very, very nervous about his own security, his own survival. He's terrified of what he calls colored revolutions. We were told recently here at a meeting that he's obsessed watching the videos of Gaddafi's downfall. I mean, this is not a secure man. And Russia could change. We don't know. And there are thousands, tens of thousands of people who went into the streets, not only in 2011, but when Boris Nemtsov was murdered, and then on the anniversary of his murder, and so forth. Think for a moment about the possibilities that what Nemtsov represented, the values he represented, the future he represented. Tell us why we can think that that is possible for Russia. Because there are people in this town who say Russia's always going to be the way it is. It's always been an authoritarian country. It always will be an authoritarian country. And whoever replaces Putin will be worse than Putin. Respond to that argument.
Right, that's actually a line that favors the Kremlin and its propaganda machine very much, and that's what they try to peddle themselves. If you saw the coverage on state TV of the protests we had in 2011, 2012, when there was in excess of 100,000 people on the streets of Moscow protesting against election fraud and against Putin's regime, the state TV channels would pick out like a nationalist flag or a communist flag among the thousands of people, and they were just a tiny fraction of the protesters. The vast majority were people with pro-democratic, pro-European views, but they would pick out those as kind of a subliminal message that, if whatever happens after us would be worse. And we are the lesser of the evils, and the alternative, because this is Russia, because it's not suited for democracy, blah, 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 blah. This old stereotype that unfortunately sometimes is also repeated by well-informed people in the West. And I really hope that they stop repeating this, because, for me this argument is borderline racist, that there is a nation or a people or a country that somehow is unsuited for democracy. Why? I mean, we had many countries in Europe, including in Eastern Europe, that lived under dictatorship for many decades. They're all now functioning democracies. And I have absolutely no doubt that there will come a day when Russia is also a functioning democracy. And as far as the stereotype goes, if we actually look at the facts, and I'm a historian by education, so I always like to look at the historical facts as opposed to, these stereotypes. Every time the Russian people had an opportunity to freely choose between a democratic path of development and a non-democratic one. Unfortunately, this wasn't too many times in our history, but every time they had this choice, they chose democracy over non-democracy. Be it in 1906, the first ever parliamentary election, when supporters of absolute monarchy won 0, not a single seat in the State Duma, the first Russian parliament. And the plurality was won by the constitutional Democrats, which advocated for a British-style parliamentary constitutional monarchy. Be it in 1917, when we had the election to the Constituent Assembly, which was actually already held after the Bolshevik coup, after they had seized power by force, and they lost the election to the Constituent Assembly. So they had to disband it by force because they didn't win. And again in 1991, which is something in all of ours memory, maybe not Jana, she was too little, but I certainly remember that, and that was the presidential election when Boris Yeltsin, who was the Democratic opposition candidate, beat the official Communist Party candidate, former Soviet Premier Ryzhkov, by 57% to 17. It was a landslide. So again, every single time the Russian people had a choice, they chose democracy over authoritarianism, and I have no doubt that this will happen again. And I travel a lot around Russia. I see different regions, different cities. I meet different people every week. And I see that there is a great number of people in our country who are fed up with this dead end to which this regime is leading us. This isolation, this authoritarianism, this mammoth corruption. We've always had corruption in Russia. I don't think that's a secret. But we've never had it on the same scale and in the same proportions. We have it under Vladimir Putin. People are fed up with this. And this is, I think, where the hope lies. And Boris Nemtsov always believed that they will come. And I remember, and especially remember it now, I used to ask him, do you think we will actually see a day when this happens? When this regime is over, when we'll have a normal democratic system in our country? He always used to answer me in the same way, always, you will, meaning me. So I hope now to be able to do that, although that was doubtful as well last year. But I hope to be able to do that now. And frankly, we do all we can, even now, to make sure that happens. And I think the best indicator, frankly, is the Putin's regime own reaction. They say they have 86% in the polls. So why do they disqualify the opposition from every significant election? Why do they disband and beat up protesters and peaceful opposition rallies? Why do they put people in jail for 3 years for staging one-man protests on the streets of Moscow, as they just did with Ildar Dadin? Why do every time we, as Open Russia, hold events around the country, or we try to hold seminars, lectures, even lectures by historians, even just debates, on topical local issues, we have 2 police squadrons arriving, getting everybody out of the building, pressuring our activists, saying there's a bomb threat and all the rest of it. They are afraid to allow even the smallest manifestation of independent civic activity in the country. That's not the behavior of a government that has 86%. That's the behavior of a weak regime. I don't think so.
Can I reply to you?
Sure.
First of all, I would like just to answer your question, but first of all, I will comment on what you have just said. It's very normal for a regime like Putin's, which is not 100% authoritarian, in my opinion. It's a hybrid regime, because there is no 86%, because it's a support of a leader which has no visible alternative. And out of this 86%, I think that 50% just do not care. They are passive. And in any country, the active people are minority. It's 20 or 30%. And of course, the government, like Russian government, they're afraid of minority, because these people can bring change to Russia. That's why they attack minority. But there are no massive repressions. They target different people to show to others what might be the results. And this breeds fear. And that's why, according to their poll conducted by Levada Center, there was a nice question they asked people. They asked, do you fear to openly say what you think about current political situation? And 26% said yes.
And these are the people who said it. So actually there are obviously more. These are the people who admit that they're afraid.
Yes, but it's a big figure. And it means that all these polls do not reflect reality in Russia.
Sure.
Secondly, you asked a question about the possibility of a revolution. I do not believe in it. I do not believe in a revolution in Russia in the short term, because I want to quote Natalia Zubarevich. She is a prominent economist, Russian economist, and she deals with regional problems, and she has a nice quote. The swamp is a flexible and sustainable ecosystem. And what we have now in Russia is a swamp.
You're not just a journalist, you're a political scientist, and I think you're a political strategist. No, I like this hybrid language and quoting all the polls.
You want to undermine my journalistic unbiasedness. There are journalists with firm political convictions, especially in Russia. For example, I would like to have an example. Viktor Shenderovich. he's a journalist. Or Dmitry Bykov, he's a poet and a journalist. It's a normal thing. All independent journalists in Russia, they tend to be pro-democratic and they tend to be anti-Putin. That's a very specific environment in which we live right now. So that means being an independent journalist is to not to necessarily support Putin. So I'm not a political figure. I am not going to run for the elections.
You're a political scientist.
No. No. You are exaggerating.
Well, maybe a little bit, but no. But once you embrace this idea of hybrid, there are spaces. There are spaces, and that's where the fear of colored revolution. That's where the fear of colored revolution comes from. But following up on the idea of swamp, John, could you, talk about the dead end to which Putin is leading Russia? I know we've talked about the talented younger people in Russia who are leaving. On top of that, the economic crisis, the demographic crisis. I mean, can there be a future for a country if they don't open up and take a more modern and tolerant course?
It's actually pretty simple. To succeed in the world today, as a society, you have to open up. You have to permit your people to both explore their potential and to achieve some profit from that exploration. The countries which have been done extraordinarily well over the past 20, 25 years have all opened up to the global economy. That's true even of authoritarian working. In Russia, the corruption is so large that individuals who have talent, if they don't have a krisha, a roof, a protection, they will be expropriated. And as a consequence, many young Russian entrepreneurs and many middle-aged Russian entrepreneurs are leaving Russia. The talent is fleeing the country. Russia's economic growth over the past 25 years has been due essentially to one thing: richness of their gas and oil reserves. It's not been built on the talent of the Russian people. In Soviet days and in the early post-Soviet period, Russia had, on a per capita basis, perhaps more Nobel Prize winners in the sciences and in mathematics. Those are the fields from which the great tech breakthroughs come. Yet Russia has no real world-class tech company because the folks who have the ability to create that are not given the space in which to do it. And that's why even before oil prices fell a couple of years ago, the Russian economy had begun to stagnate because they didn't have a system which enabled its people to unleash their potential. And this is why they have a emigration problem with their best and brightest, and this is why they're limiting their future.
Can I just a quick comment on this,
please.
Carl? If I it's important to
Go
make
right
it clear
ahead.
that Putin is happy about people leaving, because who is leaving? It's the people who went on Bolotnaya. It's the people who have an active position. It's the people who are, pro-European, integrated in the world community. They're happy about them here. Let them all leave. Because people like Zhana, people like Ilya, like Pavel, and we have many of those people here in the room, they're happy about it. Let them all go. They're the troublemakers.
Right.
And they'll be left with just the obedient people who
guarantees Russia's third world status in a generation.
Of course.
It's a dying.
And this goes to the question.
It's a great tragedy against the Russian people and the tradition of Russian history.
It's not just a tragedy, I would argue it's a crime. And it's a
Yes.
crime against our long-term interests.
Yes, that's right.
And I think one of the biggest tasks before a future democratic government, a post-Putin government in Russia, will be to try to bring those people back, as many of them as we can, because we can't build a new modern European society without them. And he's happy about them leaving. Let them all go.
And that's why it ensures Putin's regime sustainability, the ability for people, the opportunity to leave.
Yeah, that's one thing. They have a lot of things in common with the Soviet regime, but that's one thing they never will have. They will never close the borders because they're happy about the big people leaving.
Well, it's sort of terrible when you have a regime whose only interest is staying in power, and they're prepared to do anything. David, last question before we open it up. I mean, you've served in the State Department and so forth. You think about these questions all the time. We know that the future of Russia resides within Russia and the people of Russia and people like yourselves. But what can be done constructively, meaningfully by people here?
A few things. One is don't enable the regime. For those of you who haven't read it, I strongly urge you to take a look at Lilia Shevtsova's series in the American Interest, which has just been terrific, in talking about people who try to rationalize the Putin regime. Throughout the West, not just the United States, also in Russia too. For us, it is looking at ourselves, making sure we are not importing Russia's greatest export, which is corruption, not letting Russian officials, the circle around Putin, use our Western financial systems, buy our assets. They obviously don't trust their own system. They don't keep money in their own country. They trust us and our systems, and they exploit it. We should cut off those avenues to them. We should really ramp up our investigations of corruption. The FIFA investigation is terrific. We should look at the International Olympic Committee. Why is it that the Olympics, more often than not, are held in authoritarian regimes? Brazil is in a different category all by itself. And look at purchases of high-ticket items here in the United States. Where did the money come from? Senator Wicker's letter about Mikhail Lesin was fantastic. That should be done for a lot of other purchases here in the United States. Condos in Miami and New York, you name it. So we need to be looking at ourselves and our complicity in allowing this corruption to flourish, and in our country too. And we also need to talk to our European friends, where in this country, receiving Russian money for a political party is illegal. In France, Marine Le Pen thinks it's the necessary thing to do. Gerald Knaus, a few years ago, wrote an article about Azerbaijan called The End of Shame. And we seem to have lost our sense of shame, where we rationalize, try to justify taking Russian money or Azerbaijani money, you name it. And we need to do a much better job of looking in the mirror and making sure we are not complicit with the crimes of the Putin regime. It's where we have a responsibility. We underestimate our ability to have an influence. Absolutely agree 100%. These two and others including in this room, are going to decide the future of Russia. But we don't have to make their task more difficult by rolling up our sleeves and taking the corruption that comes from Moscow.
Well, terrific. Why don't we open it up? I see a number of hands already. We'll start here. I think there's going to be a floating mic. Get it, introduce yourself, and then, try to keep your question relatively succinct.
Andrei Larionov, Kate Institute. First, Zhana, this regime is not hybrid. And the fate of your father is a very clear confirmation it is not hybrid. Death is real, as well as the death of Anna Politkovskaya, Alexander Litvinenko, and tens of thousands of people in Chechnya, in Russia, in Georgia, in Ukraine, in Syria. It is not hybrid. It's a very harsh authoritarian regime. But I have a question for you. In the very well-publicized report, Threat of National Security, or to National Security, there is one question that mentions one particular name, not of executioner, but the person who looks like from this question is very much aware what happened with assassination. Mr. Zolotov. That name has been mentioned next day in the article of Novaya Gazeta with the same connotation. Should we read correctly as Mr. Zolotov, a person who passed the order, hint, desire to executioners? And my answer, Carl, to your question, what might be done here in the West, in the United States, in Europe, and other countries? The West should expand sanction list, including not only those who directly involved and who directly have criminal responsibility, with those who have political responsibility, meaning the political leadership of this regime. They are there, they have resources, they have opportunities to influence their colleagues, to investigate the crimes, they did not do it. They have the opportunity to express publicly their disagreements. They are silent. Moreover, they're working on their positions, helping regime, making it stronger. So that is why they not only agree with that, they're helping this regime. So that is why they're sharing political responsibility for all those crimes and for those thousands of people and tens of thousands of people who have been killed. They must be included in the sanction list. And that's a very powerful instrument in your hands.
Thank you, Andrei. I think, certainly the question was addressed to you about hybrid, but it's also broadening the sanctions list and so forth, and I'll open it up to everyone. Please, go ahead, Jana.
Thank you very much, Andrei. I'm not a political scientist.
Google. You're smarter than a lot of political scientists.
To have a broader discussion on the nature of a hybrid regime, but I still believe it is hybrid. I don't want to challenge your arguments, but I have my own arguments. Also out of your question, because you mentioned Novaya Gazeta, it would have been impossible to have Novaya Gazeta if Putin's regime had been harsh authoritarian. Because Novaya Gazeta is an independent media outlet, and there are many others. So we have partial freedom of press, which is a feature of a hybrid regime. Also, we have opposition leaders. One of them is here, and registered opposition parties. Of course, we have elections which are not real elections because it's not a question of power transition, but still, they can take part in these elections. That's why I think it is hybrid. But of course, I agree with you that it tends to become more and more authoritarian. That's not a question. The second question about Viktor Zolotov is a very good question, and thank you for this. He is the Minister of Interior of Russia.
Commander of Interior Troops.
Commander of Interior Troops, yes. The Commander of Interior Troops. I filed an application to question him, by the way. And you understand that it was refused. Why I wanted him to be questioned is because Zaur Dadaev, the main suspect, those who committed the crime, a triggerman, at the time he committed this crime, he was a servant at the Battalion North. Battalion North is a military arm of the Ministry of the Interior. So that's why I had a legal ground to question him. Also about Zolotov, he was a bodyguard of Putin. He is on good terms with Kadyrov, as far as I know. That's why I wanted to question him. But I was refused. And because I was refused to question Viktor Zolotov, Kadyrov, and some other people, Alam Delimkhanov, Suleiman Geremeyev, Ruslan Geremeyev, I cannot answer your question because we don't have an objective investigation. All other things are very theoretical. I don't know what role he might play in this assassination, but I took it. I tried to question him, but you understand what's going on with the investigation.
Just a quick comment, Andrei Nikolaevich, thank you for the question about Zolotov. I think the only thing we know for sure is as a fact that those alleged perpetrators who are under arrest now for Boris's murder, they are at the same time subordinates to Kadyrov and to Zolotov because they were in the structure of the interior troops. This is why the case is going to trial in a Moscow district military court, because the accused gunman was a serving officer in the Russian Interior Ministry at the time of the murder. So formally they are all under Zolotov, de facto they are all under Kadyrov, so this is the link. And there were a lot of press reports that Zolotov was very close to Kadyrov, that he went to see Kadyrov last year after Boris's murder already, when there were mixed messages coming from the top Russian leadership. He went to see him as a gesture. So I think he's an important figure in this. Of course, I don't have any inside information, obviously, and no facts on this case, but I can only state my own personal opinion. I do not believe that the assassination of the opposition leader in front of the Kremlin could have been some kind of independent act without coordination from Moscow. This is my personal opinion. I do not believe that was possible. The current regime that we have in our country, whatever we want to describe it as, does not allow for such independent acts. Not on this level, not in such a place. So this is my personal opinion. On your question about sanctions, absolutely. This is why we're pushing to get those propagandists added on the list. I mean, they did not pull the trigger literally, so they're not criminally liable if we're talking, you know, the letter of the law. But they are the ones who created this atmosphere, day in and day out, using government resources and government-controlled airwaves. So I think they are responsible, and they should answer for it. And this also goes for all those others who are responsible in a political way. Unfortunately, I mean, we're not even at the stage of discussing sanctions for political responsibility. In my view, the Magnitsky Law is being implemented very timidly in this country, even against people who actually have real liability, not political, real. When Boris Nemtsov came here for the last time, that was 2 years ago, in the beginning of 2014, we went with him to see, you know, various people around this town, senators, congressmen, and we gave them a list that included 13 people who were involved in various degrees in actions that are sanctionable under the Magnitsky Law. It included, for instance, General Bastrykin, whom we mentioned today, head of the investigative committee, who personally went out and threatened a leading independent journalist in Russia, Sergei Sokolov from Novaya Gazeta, with murder, personally. And also, you know, try to laugh about it, saying, you know, don't worry, because I'll be in charge of the investigation as well after I kill you. And he actually admitted it. It's not allegedly, or, you know, he actually said it. He said sorry for it afterwards, but he did it. And there are other things he was responsible for. That list included Vladimir Churov, who we all know is complicit in mass election fraud in 2007-8, again in 2011-12. This list included prosecutors in the Bolotnaya case, prosecutors in the Yukos case, people who tortured and caused the death of Vasily Alexanyan. None of these people has been added to the sanctions list yet, 2 years on. Not one, at least to the open section. I mean, we heard various rumors about Bastrykin and the classified section, but nothing, it's not an open and public information. So unfortunately, we're not even at the stage of getting people sanctioned who are actually personally complicit legally in those violations. So we're hoping that with this news from the European Parliament yesterday about the propagandists being added, I'm certainly hoping that that may be a first step to something like, because again, there will come a day when these people will face responsibility for their actions inside Russia, according to the law. But for while it's not possible, we have to get responsibility where we can. And knowing the habits of these people, which David mentioned, you know, they like to say whatever they want about Western countries, how it's decadent, how it's, you know, all this vilification on a daily basis, but these are the countries they like to travel in, they like to keep their assets in, they like to send their kids to study, and they like to buy properties in. And this has to stop. This is the very least we can do.
Terrific, terrific. John, you had your hand up.
I was going to say, and I'd be interested in what Vladimir and Jana have to say about this. It seems to me that as a result of the murder of your father, it became clear to more people, became clear to me, that there are serious divisions among Putin's pillars of support. There are serious divisions between the FSB and the Chechens. And I think we saw that in the fact that, well, first you see these articles coming out laying the responsibility for the murder at the Chechens and maybe at Kadyrov's door itself. You saw those peculiar articles last year about the marriage of the elderly aide to Kadyrov and a young Chechen woman against her will. And Putin has by and large stepped aside as this has happened, although recently he said something about Kadyrov like he has to obey the laws of Russia, which is very mild language, but still a certain chastisement. What's the political meaning of this?
Can I ask? It's another question for political scientists.
Jana, take your microphone.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. It's another question for political scientists, but for me, on the outward, there are always internal conflicts between different elite groups in any country, in any regime. But on the outward, it's a monolith system.
Right, but we're seeing it's not.
On the outward, it is a monolith system because Bastrykin, what Vladimir said and what I said, when the investigative team, and it's a good example, then the investigative team wanted to officially convict Gerasimov of organizing the assassination, Bastrykin didn't sign it 2 times. That That means that, yes, they can have some conflicts and disputes, but on the outward, for me, this is a monolith system.
Or could it mean he got instructions not to sign?
Круговая порука как будет?
Сейчас. Задаешь тоже вопрос. Mafia. Well, she means mafia-style protection system where everybody covers up everybody else.
Yeah, well, it's called a mafia state. I mean, there's a new book out about a mafia state.
But I just want to quickly also respond to what the ambassador said. I think all of those, I mean, we always have these Byzantine, suggestions, and like in the old days, people used to look at who's standing next to whom on the mausoleum. But I think all of those were answered last week when Putin invited Kadyrov to the Kremlin, shook his hand on cameras, and signed a decree appointing him acting head of Chechnya. And a few weeks ago, he publicly thanked Kadyrov for his effective work. This was just a week after he put Kasyanov and myself in the crosshairs as a response.
No, he has largely backed Kadyrov. That's correct.
Absolutely. And the Kremlin chief of staff, Sergei Ivanov, also around the same time, about a month ago, said, and I quote, "The Russian government does not have any questions for Ramzan Kadyrov." End of quote. I think we can have no questions for the Russian government after this. This is their answer. Whatever signs or mixed messages we could have seen, they responded to them.
Okay.
Okay, let's go to the audience. Let's take 3 people, and then we'll all respond so we can go back and forth. I hear Nadia here. There's a hand over there, and there's a hand over there. So 1, 2, 3.
Nadia Makano, U.S.-Ukraine Foundation.
Speak up.
A comment and 2 questions. First, to Jana, for your father, and Vladimir, for your friend, our condolences on his assassination. And second, deepest gratitude of his stand with the people of Ukraine. That I think possibly contributed also to the timing of this, because he was about to release a report about the war that Putin is denying in Ukraine, and you had held demonstrations in Moscow in support of the people of Ukraine. And I know that report was subsequently finished and presented here. So again, appreciation for the stand that you continue to take. My question is, are there still contacts between you and groups inside Ukraine, and do you feel support from within Ukraine? And the second question goes to sanctions. For David and maybe Vladimir, the whole issue of sanctions is important to you and also in Ukraine. And David mentioned the support commercials on Russian TV. But what is more troubling is that many of these major companies have upped their lobbying efforts for the removal of sanctions. So, appreciate response.
Okay, there was. Okay, please.
Hello, my name is Natalia Baltyanskaya. There is such an idea that the best way to stop Mr. Putin is to let him leave Kremlin without any problems. The other idea is that he would be included in the sanctions. What do you think about this, about the conflict of these 2 ideas?
Thank you. And then there was a hand there. Please. Take the mic and introduce yourself, please.
Tanya Nyberg, Magnitsky Act Initiative. I'm sorry, I will use it for an announcement. Vladimir told about the idea to rename a street in DC, Nemtsov Street, and I'm just, if somebody can help us, we are local activists, please can you after just come to me and introduce yourself. I'm so sorry. Yeah, thank you very much.
So you've organized a committee for that purpose. That's great. Okay, please.
About Ukraine. I'm not an official or the member of the opposition, political activist. That's why I can only say that when we were at the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, the Ukrainian delegation signed motion for resolution to appoint a special reporter. That's why I'm very grateful for them. And the second thing, I went to Ukraine to interview Klitschko. So these are the only contacts I had with Ukraine. With sanctions, it's for Vladimir. And these two outcomes, I do not believe that Putin will believe anybody who would tell him he can leave the Kremlin without any problems. That's why he won't leave the Kremlin in both cases. On his own will, of course.
On Ukraine, Nadia, thanks for the question. And it was a position of principle for Boris, always. Both on the annexation of Crimea, he believed that Russia must be a responsible, fully fledged member of the international community, and that our word should mean something. And our country signed that memorandum in 1994. Our country signed that friendship accord with Ukraine in 1997. Both of them mentioned territorial integrity. And he believed it's an anti-Russian thing, what Putin did. And he always said that it would take a great deal of effort to make Russia and Ukraine into enemies, countries that have so much common heritage and so much common history, and people who traditionally have great affection for each other. But I have to say, Mr. Putin managed to do this. And this is why, if you remember the very first March of Peace that Boris led on the streets of Moscow in March 2014, one day after the annexation of Crimea, there was tens of thousands of people attending, and there was direct that was on air in the Verkhovna Rada hall in Ukraine, and all the deputies stood up and applauded because this was the real Russia. These were the people who braved the authorities, the police, the atmosphere, all of it, to come out and say, no, this is not in our name. And this was a position of principle for him. And I certainly hope that at some point we'll be able to restore affection and kinship between Russia and Ukraine as two independent sovereign countries, but we are neighbors and we have to live with each other and hopefully live with, in friendship and cooperation. And one day I still hope this will happen. On the sanctions, certainly there's a lot of pressure, especially in the European Union, because of course their sanctions process is much more cumbersome than the US sanctions process. Here it's just the president's executive order. There you have to get 28 countries to agree unanimously, once every 6 months. So the next summit is going to be in June, I believe. Yep. And we already hear a lot of, not even rumors, but actually information about the Hungarians, the Austrians, the Spanish, the Italians, some say even the Germans potentially pushing for at least the reduction of sanctions. Whenever my colleagues in the opposition and I meet with European lawmakers and policymakers, we ask them, we tell them that it's important to stand firm for their own principles. And I'm more in favor of, as you know, of personal targeted sanctions. I don't believe Russia as a nation should be punished for the actions of this unelected regime. But I believe that the personal sanctions should be greatly expanded and go not only after those who are involved in the Ukraine aggression, the anti-Ukraine aggression, but also those who are responsible for domestic human rights abuses. Because human rights are not an internal affair, as we know. And of course, as David mentioned, one directly follows from another. The government that abuses the rights of its own citizens will also abuse with time the borders and the rights of its neighbors in other countries. This is what we saw. So I'm sorry, because it would really not be a helpful message if sanctions, especially personal sanctions, targeted sanctions against crooks and abusers are reduced. Certainly not at this time. And again, there shouldn't be sanctions against Russia as a nation. There should be sanctions against individuals involved in the abuse. And there are many of them. And only a few are on sanctions lists so far. So we hope to see those lists expanded.
David, do you? Maybe you'll also address this question that implicitly Nadia raised, which is the relationship of Ukraine to Russia. And what does it mean for Russia if Ukraine succeeds?
Actually, maybe if you, but let me pick up on the sanctions idea. There are, of course, two sets of sanctions on Russia. One is Magnitsky, as Vladimir talked about, and I agree completely. It has not been implemented anywhere near enough. But it does have an impact, because if it didn't, why would Bastrykin and Kadyrov be on the classified list? There is nervousness, concern about putting them on the unclassified list. That suggests that these sanctions do have an impact. And I strongly favor actually moving them from the classified to the unclass. On Ukrainian-related sanctions, you're absolutely right. There is a push among lobbyists and certain companies to lift these sanctions. Secretary Liu gave a speech the other day on sanctions that frankly was not well timed as Europeans struggle with renewal of sanctions. It wasn't a bad speech, but it wasn't very helpful as we try to keep the Europeans on board. But the bottom line, as you and I have discussed many times, is Russia has not fulfilled a single condition under the Minsk ceasefire, not a single one. And as Secretary Liu did say, if Russia fulfills them, and this was where he was very unhelpful, then the sanctions would be lifted, because he didn't talk about Crimea. There are actually two subsets of sanctions on Ukraine. One is for Crimea, the illegal annexation. The other is for what's gone on in Donbass. And so there is no argument that holds up on why sanctions should be lifted. What is happening in Ukraine is separate and different. Europeans want to cite that as an excuse to go ahead because Ukrainians haven't passed legislation on local elections. That should have never been in the Minsk deal to begin with. That's for Ukrainians to decide, not for Russians to have a say in. On the issue of Putin and sanctions, I've supported adding Putin's name from the beginning. I don't know, again, at what point, how many more countries does Putin have to invade? How many more people does he have to kill before we say, okay, he should be on the list? There are precedents for putting presidents on the election. I realize putting the president of Russia, I agree he's not duly elected, but putting the president of Russia is a different issue than putting Lukashenko from Belarus on the sanctions list, or Mugabe. But again, when do we say enough is enough? It seems to me we reached that point a long time ago.
John?
One brief point on sanctions. I think it's highly likely that the Europeans will renew them this summer. The signs coming in are heading in that direction, despite the fact there are individual countries that don't want them. If that doesn't happen, then Minsk is dead. On the Kremlin,
Minsk may be dead anyway, but go ahead.
Yeah.
that will be the final spike. There's no question the Kremlin does not want Ukraine to succeed. The Kremlin's argument is there's a unique Slavic civilization of which they are the main part, which all Slavs must adhere to. And if Ukraine develops as a democracy, as a thriving market economy, which is within its grasp if the Russians would simply withdraw, and if the West provides the necessary support, and if the political leadership does the necessary on reforms, that would be a very bad example to Mr. Putin's thesis. He would not be able to justify his own kleptocratic regime if Ukraine is prospering. And that is at least as important as the notion that the West is spreading east into his territory to explain the Kremlin's aggression against Ukraine.
And why should people be able to speak Russian freely in one country but not in another?
That's right.
Can I just build on that and something we were talking about earlier, which is this notion that Putin is defending and pursuing Russia's national interests. It's nonsense. Putin is pursuing his own interests. As you said, Carl, staying in power, that is his interest. That's his number one, number two, number three goal. It is not in Russia's interest to invade neighboring states and push away all your neighbors unless you apply force and coerce them into signing the Eurasian Economic Union. It is not in their interest to be going after opposition forces in Syria when they have issues in their own country. It is not in their interest to keep people from expressing their own views. This notion that Russia is defending its interests, the argument about NATO. NATO was not an issue in 2013 for Ukraine. No one was talking about NATO enlargement for Ukraine. It became a post facto justification by Putin and also some of the apologists in the West for it. It is a nonsense argument. So we need to be much clearer about who's pursuing Russia's interests. It is not Mr. Putin.
And Carl, can I just add a couple of words on what the ambassador said, because I think it's really important to emphasize. We've always said from the very beginning, from the beginning of 2014, that Putin's motivation behind his aggression against Ukraine was 100% domestic. It wasn't about geopolitics, it wasn't about spheres of influence, none of that nonsense. I mean, it could be a helpful addition for him, but the primary motivation was he really didn't enjoy those pictures of Mr. Yanukovych boarding his helicopter at Medjugorje and fleeing, as hundreds of thousands of people were standing on the streets of Kiev. He really didn't enjoy the precedent, because a democratic and successful Ukraine would be an example for Russian society in a way that, for instance, a democratic Estonia isn't, because we are so different. We are not so different from Ukraine. And if Ukraine was allowed to succeed, that would be a contagious example for Russian civil society, and he was really afraid of that. That's why he set out to do everything he could to prevent Ukraine from succeeding.
Yep. Let us never forget that. I think we have time, if people want, for one more round. If there are any other hands, let me see. I see one over here and one in the back. Why don't we take those two and then we'll get the answers and we'll wrap up.
Thank you. My name is Nadezhda Smakhtina. I'm a Fulbright grantee here studying international affairs in America.
Louder.
Sorry. My question is to all of you, and specifically maybe to Zhanna, because she mentioned that. Regarding leadership change in Russia, do you believe in peaceful transition?
Do you believe in what?
Peaceful transition.
Peaceful transition. Okay. Okay. And in the back?
Amy Knight. I just am wondering if maybe Vladimir or Zhanna would like to elaborate a little more on what they think the relationship between President Putin and Kadyrov is. I know that some people feel that he is allowed to act with impunity and can do pretty much what he wants, even in Moscow. But there are others, for example, Ahmed Zakayev, who say that Kadyrov would never, given that his men have been implicated in the murder of Nemtsov, that he would never, Kadyrov would never do this without the sanction of Mr. Putin. And I just wondered what your views are on that.
And that's, of course, a question raised in the Washington Post editorial today. So,
One more question, Colonel Nez.
oh, okay. Go right ahead. There's Mike will come.
Ginta Polobinskas, West Virginia State University. I'd just like to round back and ask, it's a philosophical question, what will it take for the Russian people to follow Nemtsov's example and move towards democracy with courage and conviction?
You mean all the Russian people? Because you certainly have some Russian people.
Right, no. I mean the general population.
Yeah, okay. You want to go?
Давайте начинаем.
About peaceful transition, I'm a citizen of Russia. It's not a matter of belief, it's a matter of preference. Of course, I want for my country to have a peaceful transition, not a bloody transition. And revolution is a bloody transition. Kadyrov and Putin, I think that I would like to quote Putin himself, saying that he regards Kadyrov as his son. I have nothing to add to what he said.
Quite a family.
He said it many years ago, by the way. You can find it on the internet. About people who want to be like my father, there are few people in Russia, not a lot of them, and that is very understandable because people do not tend to bear substantial risks. And that is awful that fighting for democracy requires so much courage, and you have to put at risk your life of your family, your health, your freedom. That is unbearable. Not only to fight for democracy, but just to say what you think. Now it's like that, unfortunately, but I hope that it will change. And by the way, Boris Nemtsov Foundation Freedom has established Boris Nemtsov Prize for courage in fighting for democratic values in Russia. It will be awarded on the 12th of June, which is the Independence Day of Russia, and it has a monetary value of 10,000 euros. And I think it's a good motivation, or not motivation, just help for these people.
Terrific.
Thank you. Thanks for your question. I'll start with your question, if I may. You're setting a really high standard here, because I've been in political life in Russia for many years. There is no one like Boris Nemtsov. No one. A person of such conviction, such determination, such strength, such communicative talent. I mean, he could speak, he could enter, and I've seen this many times, he could enter a hall of hostile people, who would be like this again. 20 minutes later, they were all for him. He was a person who could find common language with US senators, European parliamentarians, with local market salesperson in Yaroslavl, for instance, as he did in his last election campaign, where, of course, there was no media, no opportunity to campaign. So he literally just walked with his own feet around the district and won. That was 3 years ago in 2013. And, of course, few people would be willing, with a background like his. He was number 3 person in Russia, the first deputy prime minister. He could have easily settled for a nice, quiet life somewhere abroad, or just been integrated into the present regime very easily, like so many so-called former Democrats did. He chose not to. Again, we don't have people like him, so that's an impossible standard you're setting. Having said that, there are many people in Russia, as I mentioned, who are fed up with what's going on today, and who see a future based on democracy, based on European integration for Russia, based on rule of law, based on respect for international norms and human rights of Russian citizens. There are many people like that around our country, and this is where the hope lies, I think. Even if they are a minority, like Jana said, they're a very active minority, they're a very educated minority, and frankly, I think they're the best people our country has. On the question of Kadyrov and Putin, again, I'll repeat what I said a few minutes ago. I don't believe that the structure of the current political regime in Russia allows for any kind of independence or of any actors within it. And I think there is a frightening irony in the fact, given the history of relationship between Putin and Chechnya, given that he came to power in the background of carpet bombings of Chechen towns and cities, and given that Russian Democrats were the ones opposing this campaign of violence and standing up, for peaceful accords with Chechnya, for the rights of the Chechen people, there's a frightening irony in the fact that it's Chechens today who are used by the Kremlin as attack dogs on Russian Democrats. And I think we have to keep that in mind. And I think all of the things Kadyrov is doing, even the things he's doing publicly, like public threats against us, calling us enemies and foreign agents and showing us in crosshairs of a sniper gun and all the rest of it, the rallies he held in Grozny, I don't believe that's any kind of independent action. I think they're deliberately being used as the front line of attack against us. So that's the relationship as I see it. And on your question of peaceful transition, the Kremlin likes to accuse us, the opposition, of being revolutionaries. They created this new movement called anti-Maidan, these pro-Kremlin thugs who parade around the streets of Moscow, again calling us enemies and traitors and all the rest of it. But if anybody actually is preparing a revolution in Russia, it's the people who are in the Kremlin today. Like 100 years ago, when the biggest revolutionary was Nicholas II by his actions. Today, the biggest revolutionary is Vladimir Putin. Because nothing is forever, and the present regime is not an exception. It's not going to be forever. Only if you eliminate elections as a meaningful process, if you eliminate media pluralism and media freedom, if you eliminate the justice system as an independent force, you are the one making sure that whenever change comes, it will not be as a result of a constitutional process, because you've destroyed the constitutional process. And it's not a question, again, of belief, and not even a question of preference, like for Jana, who is not, as she keeps emphasizing, she's not a part of the opposition, she's not a politician, I am. So for us, it's also a question of obligation. We have to do everything we can to make sure that that revolution, which will happen, it's inevitable, and Mr. Putin is the one who is making it happen, not us, but we have to make sure that it is peaceful, that it is bloodless, that it is velvet, if you will, to use a historical analogy. And we will do everything in our power to make sure this is what it is.
Can I add a little bit about, I just, it popped up in my head, I interviewed I interviewed Mikhail Khodorkovsky, and I liked how he described Putin's regime. He said that Putin does not have any legal system of checks and balances. That's why he has his own system, and he doesn't want to rely only on one group, on FSB. That's why he has 2 or more rival groups he's relying on, that empowers his regime, that makes his regime more resilient. And that's why there might be some conflict between Kadyrov and FSB, but he relies on both, and he inspires probably these conflicts. That's a specific system of checks and balances we have in Russia. I think that's a good description of what's going on in Russia.
Divide and rule.
Yes.
I'm going to make you a political scientist before this meeting is over.
I'm just quoting clever people.
I want to say that, this discussion, what Vladimir just said, the discussion about hybrid and so forth, it reminds me of something that Abraham Lincoln once said. I think it was in 1858 in the debates with Douglas. And he said, a house divided against itself cannot stand. And it can be a brutal system, but that doesn't make it undivided and totalitarian. And Russia today is a house divided against itself, and it's not going to be able to stand. I want, first of all, to thank these co-sponsoring organizations. I just think it's wonderful we all came together for something like this. It's very, very important, and it's a source of great happiness for me that we were able to come together. And then also just being here with, I met Zhana for the first time, and Vladimir and I have known each other for a long time, but it's just a source of real joy to meet you and to be with both of you at a session like this. And I want to just close by saying something that I said at the meeting we had in the Senate, sponsored by the Atlantic Council just a month ago, about solidarity. And I said that if we forget the Russian Democrats, our country, meaning the United States, will lose contact with its roots and values, and the result will be devastating for our national interests and our national identity. And I think that's something we need to keep in mind as we move forward. So thank you very much. Thank you, Colin.
Thanks a lot, Colin.